Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of biology. Today I'm going to go through a PowerPoint with you guys about Darwin and his experiences and how that led to the development of the theory of evolution and Darwin's 6 key points. As mentioned in your instructions, go ahead and treat this like if we were doing notes in class. Write down what you need to get down in your notebooks. Remember, you can abbreviate things, kind of get to the point, summarize things that we're going through. So with no further ado, I'll go ahead and get started here for you. Hope everyone is doing okay out there. Of course, it takes me a moment to remember how to do things here. All right, here we go. So we're going to be talking about Charles Darwin, which I'm sure most of you have heard before, and how his observations led to the development of the theory of evolution. By now, you should have watched the video on the differences between theory and law and understand that when we use the term theory, we're actually talking about a well-documented, supported by evidence explanation of how things occur in the natural world, not like how we use theory in regular sense of just like, I have a theory that. It's more significant when we're talking about in scientific terms. As far as taking notes, if it's in black, it's mostly just informational. You may write it down if you'd like to, or just kind of pay attention to what I'm telling you. If it's not on blue, but if it's in blue, it's a key idea that you would want to write down. So these would be the kind of things in class that you'd want to make sure you're getting down into your notebooks. So first off, we need a definition of evolution. So what is evolution? It is a change in genetic traits in a population over time. Evolution does not happen to individuals. It happens to populations, it happens to species, and it has to be a change in genetic traits, not in traits that are gained throughout a lifetime. So for example, if I were to, over this COVID break, decide that I was sick of having brown hair and dyed my hair blonde and had children, I would not pass on that blonde-haired trait, obviously. And so that would not be a genetic trait. A genetic trait is what's actually in your genes, what we've been talking about so far this semester. Okay. So Darwin was not the first one to suggest that there were, that life had changed over time. Just a couple of early ideas on evolution. You had Carolus Linnaeus back in 1735. He was really the second to classify organisms based on their traits. So looking at what they had in common and starting to recognize that things are related in different ways based on the traits that they had. So the more similar traits they had, the most likely that they were to be related to each other in some way. Georges Buffon in 1749, he proposed that species shared ancestors. And so when you looked at birds, for example here, birds were birds because birds had an ancestor that was also a bird. And so things like elephants were elephants because elephants had an ancestor that was also an elephant. And so this idea that they had a common ancestor that passed on these traits to them. That's why they were the way that they were. Erasmus Darwin in 1749, I believe that was Darwin's grandfather, he proposed that more complex life forms arose from less complex life forms. This is looking at through the fossil record that they had available at that time and noticing that as time progressed, you went from more simple organisms like trilobites to more complex organisms over many, many, many years when we start to look at the arrival of things like mammals. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he made a significant contribution in 1809. He proposed that changes in an environment cause changes in organisms. This is revolutionary at the time. The classic example is with the giraffe. Lamarck suggested that giraffes developed long necks over time because original giraffes had short necks, but due to environmental change, the leaves in trees got higher during like a drought, and so the giraffes would have to stretch their necks to get to the food, and thereby they would pass on that trait to their offspring. Now we know now that the giraffe doesn't stretch its neck and then pass on that trait, but he was onto the idea that we now know that is natural selection. The difference being is he was talking about acquired traits. What we know now are actually it's genetic traits that get passed on. Enter then Charles Darwin. So he was building his idea off of these others. He went on the HMS Beagle. It was a 5-year journey. He did not intend to go to discover or formulate his theory on how life changed over time. He just traveled on the boat as the naturalist, which was common at that time, is to have someone who was a naturalist travel on these journeys. And so really he just went, you can see his route here. They left from Plymouth up there, and they went down to South America, spent some time at the Galapagos Islands, went through Australia, back through the south of Africa, through Cape Town, and then back up to Plymouth again. A lot of talk is about his time in Galapagos Islands, but he spent a lot of time in other places as well. Really just gathering information on animal and plant life that he found in these different locations, and also looking at fossils found in these locations, and started to develop this idea and started to see this picture that life has changed over time and that there's some sort of connectivity with different organisms. So 3 important observations on his voyage. Notice that this is in blue, so this is the parts you might want to start getting down. 1, that species vary globally. Okay. 2, species vary locally. And 3, species vary over time. So the kind of connecting piece here is that there's variation in species, but you can see that they vary globally around the world, they vary locally in certain locations, and then they also vary over time periods, which you observed looking at fossils. So just to go through these really quick, varying globally, some examples here is if you look across the globe, you have species, they live in similar areas, but they're separated, and they have similar traits, but they're also different. So for example, this one is a rhea, which is from South America. It's a flightless bird, a large flightless bird, similar to an ostrich, which you find in Africa, which is a larger flightless bird. And then looking at the emu, which is in Australia, again, another flightless bird, similar traits, but they also have different traits depending on where they live. Varying locally is, these are an example of tortoises that live on in the Galapagos Islands. So they're both tortoises and they're different, but they also have similar traits. So even though they're related, they still show some different traits depending on the habitats that they're in within the same area. So not varying across the globe, but now within the same area, but different traits still. And then looking at varying over time is, we're talking over long periods of time, not varying over, a couple of days, over long periods of time. And so the evidence that he was looking at then was fossils. So if you look at this animal here, this is called a glyptodon. This is a fossil animal, does not exist anymore, hasn't for quite some time. But if you look at this, if you were to find a fossil of this, what would it remind you of? I'm sure many of you think it looks like an armadillo, hopefully. Hopefully nobody said octopus. So he was looking and comparing these different organisms over time, saying that, well, there must be some sort of connectivity, but also there's some sort of change that's occurred over time. So this leads to Darwin's 6 points. Now there's more to the story, but we want to kind of get ourselves, because of our time constraints, kind of to the point here. So these are Darwin's 6 points. Again, notice this is in blue now, so this is stuff we need to know. I'm going to give you just the 6 list, and then we'll go through and explain each. So if you notice that there's overproduction, competition, variation, adaptations, natural selection, and then eventually speciation. Okay? Now to remember these, you can remember Occam's. I know that doesn't really mean anything to you, Occam's, but if you can remember Occam's, then you can remember overproduction, competition, variation, adaptations, natural selection, and speciation. So now we're going to go through and describe what each of these means. So first thing Darwin observed is that all species overproduce. So they're making more offspring than they need. In a sexually reproducing organism, if there's 2 parents, in order to keep the population the same, constant, you would need to make 2 offspring, and that would keep the population constant. But organisms don't usually make 2 offspring. You can have things like bears that have usually about 2 cubs every year, and so that maintains the population there. But sometimes they have 3 cubs, 4 cubs. The bottom example there is, those are little Nemo fishes, little clownfishes. They lay thousands of eggs at once, and these thousands of eggs all hatch. Okay, that's a lot of offspring. In the upper right, you have those little, the twirly things. You guys know the little twirly things. They're from maple trees. I'll have 8 gazillion of them in my yard at the end of the summer. Those are the seeds of the trees, and maple trees put out millions of these every year. Obviously, if you had a million maple trees growing from one maple tree, this entire world would be covered with maple trees really fast. Okay? So first thing you notice is that there's overproduction. Just some informational things here is which animal produces the most offspring. I had to look this up, and it is okay, the African driver ant. Kind of a creepy looking ant when you look at its head. It makes 3 to 4 million eggs every 25 days. So over the lifetime, it can make up 250 million eggs in one queen's lifetime. That's a lot of kids. Okay? Now, Darwin recognizes that when you have all these kids, they need to compete for stuff. So animals, plants, they overproduce. Well, now there's going to be competition. So competition is that these offspring in each of the generation, they're going to compete for things like food, water, shelter, space, nutrients. Couple examples you have here, you have the polar bears that are fighting over what appears to be the spinal cord of a whale. And then on the other side there, you have peacocks. The reason why peacocks have those incredibly fancy giant tails is to attract the ladies, and so that is a mating competition. This little picture here, okay, let's see if we can figure out what this is. This has to do with competition. Okay, is it a colony of underwater sea snakes? So this is their housing area. Is it a trap used by crabs to catch small shrimp? And so that's their food source. Or is it a nest created by a pufferfish to woo the ladies? So let's find out. Okay. Short little video here to see how this works. It's pretty amazing what they do here.
He can't rest for more than a moment, but must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation.
He's a pretty little fella. He's only about like that big. It's pretty little.
A final tidy up, and his masterpiece is complete.
So it's a pretty impressive nest that the little pufferfish makes. I like to think about what it would be like if you were scuba diving through the ocean and you look down and you just saw a bunch of those on the bottom of the ocean, especially not having any idea where they came from. Think that like aliens made them or something, but pretty impressive. But that's a form of competition. Is pufferfish compete for mates by creating these beautiful nests, and then the females will come there and mate with the pufferfish, and then that pufferfish passes on his traits to the next generation. All right, next let's talk about variation. So individuals within a population, you have this overpopulation, that there is variation. Now I just noticed on my slide here, you can't see that last little bit, so let's fix that really quick. Should have noticed that before, but I didn't. So you have this overproduction, you have all this competition, and then in the population you have variations, which you have different characteristics. They can be very subtle, as in when you were looking at these finches here, they're slightly different in size, they have slightly different beak shapes. Looking at the flowers down below here, you have flowers that are red, flowers that are pink, flowers that are white, all different variations. These are actually a bunch of different clam shells. They look like rocks, but they're actually different shells. with a lot of different variation in the colors of these shells. So you have too many offspring being born. These offspring have to compete for resources, and then there's variation in the population. Okay. Now, talk about variation. Let's talk about ladybugs really quick. Ladybugs have some of the most variation of all the species in the world, and we don't necessarily think about that because we're used to just seeing, like the orange ladybugs with the black spots on them. But they do come in all these different kind of variations. These are all the same species of ladybugs, just different variations. And they come with different numbers of spots. Some have very few spots, some have a ton. But this variation can lead to different survivability depending on where the ladybugs live. All right, let's talk about adaptation. So far we have overproduction, too many offspring. There is competition for resources. In each of these species, you're going to have variation within the offspring. So this leads to what's called adaptations. Adaptations are due to these variations. Some are going to be better adapted to survive and pass on their offspring. So example would be faster cheetahs are more likely to catch food. Okay? A more fragrant flower is more likely to attract bees and be pollinated. The camouflaged owl here, who's kind of giving you a little wink there, is more likely to go unnoticed, meaning he's more likely to get food. And so adaptations aren't things that animals choose or plants choose, but they're the traits that allow them to either survive better or to pass their traits on through reproduction. Which takes us to our fifth of our 6 point. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about the fennec fox. Fennec fox is adorable. It's about the cutest little thing in the ever, but it's got these big, huge, giant ears, and it lives in the desert. And so when I ask students why the big ears, usually students say it's to be able to hear better, which makes sense, big ears, but there actually is a different advantage to this adaptation, specifically that it helps it release heat during the night when it's really, in the deserts when it's really hot outside during the daytime. Those large surface area of the ears helps them go ahead and release body heat in the night when it cools off. So it's actually a cooling mechanism for them. All right, let's get to natural selection. Natural selection, animals that have these more favorable traits will survive and reproduce. This is what you guys are most familiar with as far as what you've learned about evolution so far, I'm sure, is that those that have the good traits are gonna survive and reproduce. It's often referred to as survival of the fittest, but really you don't have to be the fittest, you don't have to be the fastest, you don't have to be the strongest. You just need to be fit enough in your population for the resources available to survive and pass on your traits. And another key point is surviving is important because then you can reproduce. But if you survive for a long time and you don't pass on your traits, then you're really not participating in natural selection. So it's really the reproductive piece that's important. Okay, so when they do reproduce, they pass on their traits, and the most favorable traits go to the offspring. Okay, so in effect, it's called natural selection because nature is selecting what traits get passed on to the next to the offspring. And remember, all these traits come from initially mutations. So whichever mutations in the population are most beneficial are the ones that get passed on. All right, so we've covered overproduction, competition, variation, adaptation, now natural selection. So the last one is, dang, I keep getting ahead of myself, speciation. Let's talk about the unpolluted versus polluted environments of the peppered moth. Really quick here, this is a classic example of natural selection, one that you should be familiar with, so I'm just gonna explain it to you briefly, is these are pictures of peppered moths. Peppered moths come in two varieties. They come in a lighter colored variety and a darker colored variety. As you can see on the tree on this side, this is a tree that's covered in lichen. If you're a bird flying overhead, which one are you going to be more likely to see and eat? Probably the black moth. Okay. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, in the UK, trees they lost their lichen. Essentially, the pollution from the nearby factories kind of smothered the trees in such a way that the trees themselves, the lichen can no longer grow on the trees. And so now, as the trees are starting to change due to the lack of lichen, which is kind of fun to say, lack of lichen, now who stands out more? The white moth. And so researchers looked at this over years and noticed that the population of moths, of these pepper moths, shifted from primarily being mostly light in color, pre-industrial revolution, to afterwards being primarily darker color post-industrial revolution, due to the change in their environment. So this is a classic example of how natural selection works. Okay. Now let's go to speciation. All right, speciation is our last piece that we're going to talk about here today, and we'll get to this actually probably next week, is over many, many generations, okay, these favorable traits start to build up to the point where the new individuals are so different from the ancestral species that they're no longer considered the same species, and they can't interbreed with each other, and now they're considered different species. The example that I'm giving you here are cichlids, African cichlids. All these African cichlids are descended from a common ancestor, but they have been separated throughout the area that they're found in, which is in Malawi in South Africa, and that they've all developed different traits, different adaptations based on the area that they come from. And so these, while they have a common ancestor, are now so different in form and in habit that they no longer will reproduce. And so now they're considered a different species. So that takes us up to the end of your lecture for today. One thing is I would try to, after we're done with this, see if you could list Darwin's 6 points from memory. Remember Ochvans, okay, overproduction, competition, variation, adaptations, natural selection, speciation. That's all 6. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me a message. Remember, do it over Schoology, preferably. And then go ahead and start working your way through the rest of the assignment. I hope you guys all have a good day. Bye. This is the weird part again where I have to remember how to turn everything off. And there we go. All right. Bye, everybody.